All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving deep, deep, deep into some pretty heavy stuff. We're
hmm
talking Oswald Spengler and his infamous book, The Decline of the West. We're going to be focusing on the introduction and some choice excerpts from that first volume. It's a dense book, but don't worry, we're here to help you sift through it and really get to the heart of Spengler's arguments.
when we think about history, it's often presented to us as this kind of linear progression. You start with ancient Rome, then you move through the Middle Ages, and that leads you up to the modern world. But Spengler just throws that whole linear view of history right out the window. In fact, he compares his own theory to a Copernican revolution and how we understand history.
Wow. Okay. Copernican revelation. That's a pretty bold statement. So is he saying that his ideas like totally flip our understanding of history on its head?
Yeah, pretty much. So instead of a straight line, he sees history more as a garden full of distinct cultures. And each of these cultures is like a unique organism with a lifespan. They're born, they flourish, they mature, and eventually
Hmm.
they decline.
So instead of seeing ancient Greece and Rome and the modern West as all part of the same timeline, he's seeing them as like separate flowers in this garden, each with its own shape and color and life cycle.
Exactly. And that's what he calls the morphology of world history. It's a way of understanding history,
Hmm.
not as one single narrative, but as this living, evolving system of distinct cultures. And here's where it gets even more interesting. He says each of these cultures has its own unique soul.
Hold on a sec. Soul.
Mhm.
That sounds a little mystical for a history book. What does he actually mean by soul?
He's not talking about souls in like a religious sense.
Yeah.
What he means is that each culture has this distinct inner drive, in essence, that shapes everything it creates. It's like the underlying force that influences a culture's art, its philosophy, its mathematics, even its experience of time and space.
So you're saying different cultures aren't just geographically or chronologically distinct. They actually experience reality in fundamentally different ways.
That's exactly what Spengler's arguing. He's
Yeah.
not just listing historical facts, he's comparing the souls of different cultures
Hmm.
to show how they generate entirely different ways of thinking and being in the world.
Wow. That's a pretty radical idea. I mean, it really makes you question the whole notion of universal truths, doesn't it? If different cultures literally experience reality differently, then can there really be one set of values or beliefs that applies to everyone?
Yeah, that's one of the most challenging and controversial aspects of Spengler's work. He's directly challenging the Enlightenment idea of a single universal reason and suggesting that even our most fundamental ideas about the world are shaped by the specific culture we belong to.
Okay, so I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Can you give me an example of how this soul thing manifests differently in different cultures? Like, what's the difference between the soul of ancient Greece and the soul of the West?
Okay, so let's start with ancient Greece. They were obsessed with visual harmony, with perfect forms. You see this in their sculptures, their emphasis on the human body, even their mathematics. Think about Euclidean geometry, with its focus on ideal shapes and proportions.
So their pursuit of perfect forms and proportions, it wasn't just an artistic style, it was a reflection of their whole worldview.
Exactly. Now contrast that with the soul of the West. Spengler says our soul symbol is infinite space. We're obsessed with what lies beyond, with pushing boundaries.
I can see that. We have these Gothic cathedrals reaching for the heavens, paintings using perspective to create the illusion of depth, music that constantly pushes the boundaries of harmony and complexity. It's like we're always striving for something beyond what we can see and touch. But what about Western mathematics? How does that fit into this infinite space idea?
That's where it gets really fascinating. Think about the development of calculus, non-Euclidean geometries, our fascination with concepts like infinity. These aren't just abstract mathematical ideas. They're expressions of the Western drive to explore the boundless, to venture beyond the limits of the finite world.
So for Spengler, even something as seemingly objective as mathematics is actually shaped by the underlying soul of a culture.
Absolutely. He's saying that different cultures don't just discover different things. They actually conceptualize and understand the world in fundamentally different ways. And this is reflected in everything they produce, from their art and architecture to their mathematics and philosophy.
This is pretty mind-blowing stuff. It's like looking at history through a completely new lens. It makes you wonder, if each culture experiences reality so differently, how does that affect the way history actually unfolds?
Well, that's where Spengler's distinction between destiny and causality comes in. And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've talked about how Spengler sees history as this garden of distinct cultures, each with its own unique soul that kind of shapes everything it creates. But how does this soul actually influence the course of history? Is he saying there's like some mystical force guiding these cultures towards their destiny?
It's not really mystical, but he does introduce this concept of destiny as a driving force in history.
Yeah.
You can think of it like the inner logic of a culture, kind of like a blueprint that shapes its overall trajectory and ultimately its fate.
Okay, so it's not just random events happening one after another. It's more like there's an overarching narrative, a direction each culture is moving towards.
Exactly. And this destiny is unique to each culture, just like its soul is unique. And Spengler contrasts this with causality, which is how we usually explain things in the world. Cause and effect, action and reaction.
So causality is like the nuts and bolts of how things happen. But destiny is the bigger picture, the overall arc of a culture's story.
That's a great way to put it. He's not saying causality is wrong
Hmm.
or unimportant, just that it's limited in its ability to explain the grand sweep of history. He says causality is the language of science, and destiny is the language of history.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get the distinction, but can you give me like a concrete example of how this destiny thing actually plays out in history?
Sure, Spengler actually uses the Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex as an example to illustrate this concept. Oedipus's downfall, his tragic fate, it wasn't simply the result of bad choices or unfortunate events. It was his destiny. It was like woven into his existence from the very beginning.
So no matter what Oedipus did, he was always going to fulfill that prophecy, that tragic destiny, even if he tried to avoid it. It's almost like something beyond his control was pushing him towards that outcome.
Exactly. And that's how the ancient Greeks understood destiny, as this force larger than individual will, something that shaped their lives, their cities, and ultimately their entire culture.
That's heavy stuff. It makes you wonder how much of history is actually like that, driven by these larger forces beyond our control. But, okay, so if each culture has its own destiny, what does that mean for the West? I mean, Spengler's book is called The Decline of the West. He's not exactly giving us a happy ending, is he?
That's the part that tends to make people uncomfortable. Spengler sees all cultures, including the West, as going through this natural life cycle. And he says the West has entered its civilization phase, which is marked by decline and eventual end, just like all the cultures that came before.
So it's not that the West is doing something wrong, it's just following the natural course of every culture. Like even the most beautiful flower eventually wilts and dies. It's just part of the cycle.
It's a good analogy. Spengler's not being pessimistic. He's just presenting what he sees as a fundamental pattern in history. He even says that decline isn't necessarily bad, it's just a different phase, like autumn falling summer. Each phase has its own unique beauty and purpose.
That makes sense. It's not about judging one phase as better or worse, but understanding that they're all part of a larger cycle. But so if the West is in this civilization phase, this period of decline, what are some of the signs we should be looking for? How does this decline actually manifest itself?
Well, Spengler points to a lot of trends as evidence of this civilization phase in the West. He talks about a decline in creativity, a shift from spiritual values to material success, this growing obsession with technology, and shallow entertainment. He sees the rise of mass culture, the obsession with political and economic power, and the decline of traditional art forms as symptoms of this later stage.
That's interesting because I can definitely see some of those things happening in our world today. There's this pressure to achieve, to consume, to be entertained. It does feel like we're losing touch with some deeper values.
That's exactly what Spengler was getting at. He saw these trends as signs of a culture losing its energy, losing its creative spark. He wasn't saying it's a bad thing, but it's something to be aware of, to understand the historical forces at play.
So if Spengler's right, and the West is in decline, what happens next? Does he offer any guidance on how to navigate this phase? Or is it just a matter of accepting our fate?
He doesn't really offer specific solutions or predictions, but he does encourage us to confront this reality, to understand these patterns of history, and maybe find a different kind of meaning in this later stage of our culture, even if it's not the same kind of meaning that defined its earlier, more vibrant periods.
So even if we can't stop this cycle of history, maybe we can find a way to make peace with it, to find new ways to create and connect, even as our culture enters its autumn years.
That's one way to look at it. But before we get too lost in the big picture, let's bring it back down to earth. Why should all of this matter to you, the listener? What's the relevance of these ideas in your own life? the world you're living in right now.
For me, it's like Spengler gives you this new way of looking at the world. Like you put on these special glasses, and suddenly you start to see these big historical patterns playing out, with these cycles that are always there. But we're usually too busy to even notice them.
I think that's a great point. And Spengler's ideas can help us understand some of the anxieties we're feeling in the West right now. This sense that things are changing, like the old ways aren't working anymore. And maybe we're not on this guaranteed path of progress like we used to think. Spengler gives us a way to make sense of all that.
Yeah, it's like he gives us a language to talk about these feelings that are hard to put into words. But but some people might say, okay, even if Spengler's right and decline is inevitable, what can we actually do about it? Should we just give up?
Well, Spengler wouldn't say we should just resign ourselves to decline. Remember, he saw each phase of a culture's life cycle as having its own value, even in decline. There's potential for new forms of creativity, new ways of understanding the world, new ways of being.
So instead of trying to prevent decline, maybe the key is to find meaning and purpose within it, to find new ways to flourish, even as our culture enters its autumn years.
I think that's a really insightful way to put it. It's about understanding where we are in this historical cycle and adapting to the challenges and opportunities of that specific phase.
Yeah, like instead of clinging to the past or being afraid of the future, we can focus on making the most of the present, finding new ways to be creative and connect with each other, even as our culture keeps changing.
Exactly. And I think that's where the real value of Spengler lies, not in offering some kind of prediction or solution, but in challenging us to think critically about our own culture, to see its strengths and weaknesses, and to find our own place in this big story of history.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners today? What do we want them to walk away thinking about?
I think the main thing is Spengler gives us this powerful new lens for understanding history and where we fit into it. He makes us look beyond the surface, to see these deeper patterns, and to question our assumptions about progress and decline, and what it even means to be Western.
And that's a pretty valuable tool to have, especially in a world that feels more and more complex and uncertain every day. But here's one last thought for you to chew on. Spengler wrote all this back in the 1920s, right after World War I. So how do his ideas resonate differently in our world today, a whole century later? Does our current reality confirm his predictions? Or does it challenge them?
We'll leave you with that question. Keep those brains buzzing.
Uh,
We'll catch you next time.